Hello, Social Studies 10. Today we're going to learn about the end of World War II. Now, I must say that the first part of the slideshow was created by former students, so the style may be a bit different than what you're used to. So, um, one important step to defeating Germany was the D-Day and Normandy invasion. So, this was the invasion of France by the Western Allies. So the code name for this operation was Operation Overlord. It was an extremely complicated plan, very detailed, so much so that they even built a decoy army of wooden soldiers and inflatable tanks and all sorts of things that a theater stagecraft operation made to fake Germany out and make them think that they were going to invade somewhere else. Um, so the Allies initially were looking at landing across the Pas de Calais, which is the shortest point on the English Channel, but they realized that would be impossible, partly because Germany was expecting it there. So they continued to make it seem like they would invade the Pas de Calais, and they chose instead Normandy, which wasn't too much farther, as their landing site. So Germany left the bulk of their forces in the Pas de Calais. That was where Hitler felt like they were going to land. Um, the Allies spent years loading supplies up in Britain, lots of military supplies, food, soldiers, and they now had the ability to get across the Atlantic without their boats being sunk by the wolf packs. The convoy system was working much better by this time. The leader of this operation was the Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. So here's the plan. You can see the Pas de Calais right there. Sorry, right here. So they put the decoy army here, they put the real armies here, and crossed to go to Normandy, which is here. So during the night, American and British paratroopers were dropped inland and assigned to take the back area behind the beaches. Um, this was meant to stop a major counter-assault by the Germans because they would seize roads, bridges, and railways that went to the beaches. Next, the beaches were heavily bombed to soften up their defenses. Leaving at night and arriving around daybreak was the largest armada in the world's history to both guard and ship soldiers out and bombard the shore. The Americans sent three divisions at beaches codenamed Utah and Omaha. Omaha was the most difficult beach. The British sent two divisions, beaches codenamed Gold and Sword. And Canada sent one soldier division at a beach codenamed Juno. Canadians were supported by a Polish unit. So Omaha was the bloodiest battle, and you'd be familiar with it in Saving Private Ryan. Um, Here, the beach ended with a cliff rather than a flat area behind the beach. Also, there was a very experienced German division, and whereas some of the other beaches, there were conscripts from like Eastern Europe, like places like Slovakia, where they didn't really know why they were fighting and didn't really have a lot of training or morale. The beach with the lowest casualties was Sword Beach. So here's some photos from D-Day. The first one, the top left, is soldiers who had just left the landing craft, whereas the bottom right, soldiers still in their landing craft. It's a bombing operation and some paratroopers. So, Juno Beach, the Canadian beach, had the second highest casualty rate. And Canada landed two divisions, an infantry division and an armored division. Their objective was to capture the Cayenne-Bayeux Road and the Carpiquet Aerodrome. So at the beginning, the assault looked like a disaster. Juno was well defended, and it was quite a flat beach. However, there were houses on the beach, and the Germans had turned those houses into machine gun nests. So the first waves uh, of Canadian soldiers were hit by machine guns. However, gradually the Canadians managed to overwhelm the defenders, and they made the largest advance of any other beaches, yet they still fell short of their objectives. So here we can see Juno Beach, so you can see how flat it is. However, you can see these houses that had been turned into machine gun nests. So Operation Overlord in the end was a success. All five beaches were taken, and the Allies now had a foothold in Western Europe, and very quickly they unloaded a lot of men and supplies in northern France. So this sparked the end of Germany's unchallenged control of Western Europe, and now Germany was facing a three-front war, with both the Eastern Front, where most of the fighting happened, the Italian Front, and now the Western Front. So by July, the Allies had over 1 million soldiers in France. And the advance out of Normandy was very slow. It basically took a month to get out of Normandy, but once they got out, it was quicker. So it took a month for Cayenne to be taken, which was supposed to be a first day objective. Paris was taken in late August. Hitler had ordered Paris to be destroyed, but the German governor of Paris decided that he didn't want the city to be destroyed and left without a fight. By winter, the Allies were approaching the border with Germany. So I think that's about the green zone on this line. So the Allies continued what had already been a massive bombing campaign on Germany. Hamburg had been firebombed by the British and Canadians in 1943, and this was followed up by another horrific firebombing of Dresden in 1945, where much of the city was destroyed and many civilians were killed. Some were caught in asphalt when the asphalt melted and turned into like a tar pit. So the US and Britain advanced east, and Canada was given the task of advancing north to liberate the Netherlands. Many Dutch people were starving in the winter of 1944-45 because the Germans had cut off the rations and requisitioned a lot of food. The Canadian army, which was heading north, almost got cut off by Germany's final major offensive called the Battle of the Bulge, where they tried to recreate the Manstein Plan and the original Ardennes offensive that Germany had used to defeat France and split the two armies apart in 1940. Sorry. So they tried the same strategy. It almost worked. The American 101st Airborne Division was surrounded in Belgium, but they managed to hold out. Um, and in the spring of 1945, Canada managed to enter and liberate the Netherlands at a cost of 6,300 Canadian dead. To this day, apparently Canadian veterans will still be carried if they go to the Netherlands. Um, from the Netherlands, Canada headed east along the northern coastline of Germany, where they ran into the Soviet army on the Baltic coast in late April. It was initially a very tense encounter because the Soviets were determined to keep going west and get to Denmark because any land that they were liberating, they were turning communist. They wanted to get as much land as possible. But the Canadian army held their ground, and eventually they sorted out the misunderstanding about who was supposed to be where, and they had a big party. And if you hear accounts from Canadian soldiers, they were not used to drinking vodka like the Russians were, and um, yeah, the Canadians had the worst of that party in terms of hangovers. So the Eastern Front. In 1944, the Soviets had made a huge push, but they'd stopped outside of Warsaw. Um, and in Poland, or in Warsaw specifically, there was a big rebellion by the Polish resistance. The Soviets stopped and waited for the Germans to put that down before they continued. This caused the Polish nationalists to be weakened, and therefore there was less resistance to communist government eventually taking over in Poland. In January 1945, the Soviet army crossed the Oder River into Germany. They'd already entered East Prussia, so this northern area of Germany. So the Germans prepared for the Gotterdammerung, the fallen angel, the kind of final battle to the death in Berlin. Um, and the Soviets, led by Marshal Zhukov, were willing to throw anything to take Berlin. So it was an extremely difficult and long battle for Berlin. The Soviets lost 300,000 soldiers taking it. However, in the end, they would be successful. So what was happening in Italy? In April 1945, the Allies broke through in Italy, and the German army in Italy surrendered. Mussolini tried to run away, into the Alps. However, he was caught by Italian partisans. They killed him and then hung him with his mistress upside down from a gas station in Milan. An inglorious ending. So what happened to Hitler, or supposedly happened to Hitler? So after seeing Mussolini be strung up from a gas station, Hitler decided that he didn't want this to happen to him. The first thing he did was order the destruction of Germany and German people. He said that while he was the right man, that the Germans were not the right people for him and that they were not actually the master race. Then he commits suicide, or supposedly commits suicide, the morning after, or the day after marrying his longtime mistress, Eva Braun. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, his wife Magda, killed their 6 children and then commit suicide as well. German command fell to the head of the submarines, Admiral Dönitz, who surrendered a week later on May 7th, 1945, also called VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. In Germany, the Soviets ran amok to take revenge on the Germans for the devastation that they had wreaked on their country. Soviet officers often permitted murder, looting, and raping. Estimates that between 10,000 and 2 million German women were raped during this time. And in Eastern Germany and other areas in Eastern Europe, there was a lot of ethnic cleansing where the other local inhabitants sought to remove Germans from their area and not give Germany another excuse to invade. For example, the 3 million Germans of Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia were kicked out. So here's a famous photo of a Red Army soldier flying the hammer and sickle from the Reichstag, ruins of the Reichstag. And this is a photo I took of the the Soviet War Memorial, which is actually placed in West Berlin. So that's what happened to Germany. There are some theories that Hitler may have escaped to South America. However, there's not enough information to substantiate them yet. So what happened to Japan? See in that photo. Japan began to lose in all fronts in 1945. The Americans took Saipan and the Marianas Islands, which put them within range of bombing Japanese home islands. Japan didn't have proper air defenses, and they lacked aviation fuel for proper defense. to give their fighters. So the Americans launched massive firebombing campaigns of Japan. These firebombing campaigns, uh, especially the one on Tokyo, actually ended up being more deadly than the atomic bombs. Part of the issue, which would be similar if Canada was firebombed, was most of the Japanese homes were built with wood or other flammable materials such as rice paper. So the American leadership decided that they would test their new weapon called the atomic bomb on two Japanese cities. The American leadership changed in the spring of 1945. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt died. He had been very unwell. He lived with polio, and he was replaced by his vice president, Harry Truman, who actually didn't even know that the atomic bombs existed. Um, One of the reasons why the Americans dropped the atomic bomb was they estimated that the American army would suffer 1 million deaths if they invaded Japan. The Japanese military had announced that they were prepared to fight to the very end, and that's what they've been doing on islands like Okinawa and Iwo Jima. There was a fighting to the last man almost, and it was very discouraging for the American soldiers. So the atomic bombs were created as part of the Manhattan Project. This was done in concert with Canada and the United Kingdom. So most of the work was done near Los Alamos, New Mexico. Canada supplied the uranium, and there was also a plutonium enrichment lab near Ottawa. Many of the scientists involved in this project were Jewish refugees from Europe. So you can think if there hadn't been those racist policies in Europe, perhaps Germany could have come out first in the race to build the atomic weapons. Many of these scientists and the US in general, the policy was they wanted to build an atomic bomb because Germany had been working on one and they were planning on dropping it on Germany. However, Germany had surrendered before it was finished. So the first atomic bomb was dropped August 6, 1945 on Hiroshima at a cost of around 70,000 dead civilians. However, in the end, over the years, probably around double died due to cancer and other side effects of the atomic bomb. The Japanese government refused to surrender, so the Americans dropped a second atomic bomb on Nagasaki August 9th, and this caused Japan to surrender. So here's some of my photos from Peace Park in Hiroshima. This was directly under where the atomic bomb was detonated. It was a very, very depressing day. It's very upsetting. So here's a monument to the children that were killed. These are the 10,000, I think, paper origami, 10,000 paper cranes. And this was started by a Japanese child who was dying of leukemia in the 1950s. This is a lunchbox. The day the atomic bombs were dropped, um, a middle school class, or not more than a class, middle school students were requisitioned from the surrounding areas and told to come into the city to build fire breaks in case Hiroshima was firebombed. So a lot of middle school students were killed, whereas their parents survived. Um, so the museum in Peace Park had a lot of their artifacts and the parents telling the stories of their dead kids. This granite right here has the shadow of the atoms of somebody was sitting on the steps and it was very close to the epicenter and the atomic bomb was so hot that it blasted the atoms in his shape onto the steps of the bank where he was sitting. But there was no other trace of his body. Here is the A-bomb dome. So this is directly under the epicenter almost. So the explosion went down and pushed out the ceiling, but it didn't blow down the walls because it was going down. This was built for the World Fair by a Czech architect. And the the final calculation by the Americans and why they one of the reasons why they dropped it. So they calculated 1 million American deaths and 4 million Japanese deaths if they had invaded. They looked at several different strategies. They looked at a blockade of Japan, so they would essentially starve Japan out because Japan had to import food. They also looked at the land invasion or just regular bombing Japan into submission. And another reason why they chose to use the atomic bomb, or speculated why, was many experts in the US could see that the friendship between the Soviet Union and the West would not last. And they wanted to send Stalin a message that the US had a super weapon and that Stalin better not act aggressively towards the US and the West. But it's something that's still very debatable about whether or not it was the right thing. One thing, in my opinion, is that because we could see the devastation that the atomic bomb wreaked on Japan, on those two cities, politicians, military leaders, and civilians across the world became fearful of the atomic bomb, and it gave a reason to never use it again. So at the end of the war, Canada was actually a mini superpower. Canada had the world's fourth largest army. It's quoted as the fourth largest. I would say it's actually the fifth largest because I think these totals often forget about the Chinese army. The fourth largest air force and the third largest navy in the world. Canada had over 1 million men and women in uniform, and they lost 46,000 dead out of a total population of 11 million at the time. So 10% of the country was in arms. Thank you.